All right, you know your rights, but how about your duties? Today, we're diving deep into a fascinating part of the Indian Constitution, the fundamental duties.
Yeah, and it's especially crucial for those gearing up for those UPSC exams.
Absolutely, but it's also a really interesting look at what it means to be a good citizen, for everyone in India.
Yeah, for sure. It's something that sparks some great debate, too, especially since these duties, well, they weren't originally part of the Constitution.
Right, they were added in 1976.
And one more was added in 2002.
Yeah, relatively recently. And, we're exploring this with excerpts from a text that really dives deep into the nitty-gritty of these fundamental duties. And get this, India actually took inspiration from the USSR's constitution.
Oh, wow.
The USSR. Why would a democracy like India look to a communist state for its citizen duties, right? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it really is, especially when you think about it. Major democracies like the US, Canada, France, they don't have a specific list of duties.
Right.
So what made India go down this path?
Yeah, it's a head-scratcher.
Well, to understand that, we need to look back at the Swaran Singh Committee in 1976.
Ah, yes, the Swaran Singh Committee. They were the ones who came up with these fundamental duties, and this was right smack dab in the middle of the emergency.
Yeah, 1975 to 1977.
Quite the time, right.
Yeah.
A lot of political stuff happening.
Absolutely. And this committee, they didn't just recommend some duties, they proposed some pretty strong measures to go along with them, punishments even.
Punishments? Like what?
Well, like if you didn't comply. And get this, they even suggested making paying taxes a duty.
Whoa, a duty to pay taxes. That sounds pretty intense.
It does, right? But here's the crazy part.
What?
All of that rejected.
Really?
Yeah.
Why? Why were those ideas left out?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? Were they too harsh and practical, or maybe just, didn't fit in with the idea of a free society? Makes you think.
Yeah, it really does. And for those of you studying for the UPSC, this is the kind of historical context that's super important.
Oh.
Especially for those essay questions.
Definitely.
So let's move on to the actual duties. There are 11.
11? Wow.
But instead of listing them all, let's highlight a few of the really interesting ones are.
Okay, sounds good. I mean, especially for our UPSC listeners, it's really helpful to look at the details of each duty.
Exactly. So, for example, there's cherish the noble ideals of the freedom struggle. I mean, what exactly are noble ideals? How do you even define that?
That's a great point. It's very open to interpretation, isn't it?
And then there's develop a scientific temper. Again, what does that even mean in your daily life? These aren't just simple checkboxes to tick.
Right, right. And then there's the one added in 2002, provide education for your child between 6 and 14 years. That one's tied to actual laws, but it still brings up questions about balancing parental rights with the state's interest in education.
Right.
It's a mix of moral and civic duties. And I think, especially for those studying for the UPSC, you need to really think critically about what each duty means and how it plays out in real life.
Yeah, and that's where the big debate lies, right? Are these just fancy words, or do they actually have some real impact?
That's the question. Yeah, that's the heart of it, right? Are these duties just for show, or do they actually mean something? I mean, that's a question that pops up a lot in those UPSC exams.
Okay, so let's play devil's advocate here for a sec. Some people say these duties are too vague. Like, they're hard to enforce, and really, other laws already cover them.
Yeah, I see what they're saying.
It's just moral preaching, right? No real impact. What do you think about that?
Well, it's true that some of the wording is a little open-ended.
Right.
Like, how do you actually measure if someone is truly cherishing the noble ideals of the freedom struggle? There's no way to really know for sure.
Right, yeah.
And those critics, they have a point when they say a lot of these duties, like respecting the Constitution or defending India's sovereignty, those are already kind of built into our laws.
So are they just repeating what we already have? Like,
Yeah.
Is there some overlap there?
I mean, there's definitely some overlap, yeah. But I wouldn't say the fundamental duties are completely useless.
Okay, so they're not totally redundant.
No, I wouldn't say that. They serve as a good reminder, like a little nudge for citizens to remember their responsibilities.
Okay, a reminder. I like that.
Yeah, think of it like a compass, pointing us toward the values that India stands for.
I see. So it's like they're setting a standard for what it means to be a good citizen, even if it's not always something you can, like, legally enforce.
Exactly. And they can actually influence how laws are interpreted.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For example, there might not be a law that specifically says you have to have a scientific temper.
Right.
But courts can actually use that duty to help them make decisions in cases that involve scientific evidence.
Oh, I get it. So, like, if there's a case about, I don't know, some tradition that clashes with scientific facts,
Exactly.
the courts could use that scientific temper duty to help them decide the case. That's pretty interesting. So even if they don't directly lead to legal action every time, they can still shape how laws are applied in practice.
Yeah, that's the idea. And let's not forget that Parliament could always make new laws to actually enforce these duties.
Right. Good point. They're not set in stone forever.
Exactly.
But for our listeners who are thinking about the UPSC exams, how does all of this play into answering those tough questions about fundamental duties? What should they focus on?
Well, it's all about showing that you understand the nuances. Acknowledge that there are criticisms, that the language can be vague, that there might be overlap with existing laws, but then you got to counter those criticisms.
Okay, so show both sides of the argument. Got it.
Yeah. Highlight how fundamental duties can influence new laws, how they can guide court decisions, and most importantly, how they can encourage people to be responsible citizens.
So it's not just a simple yes or no answer. It's about showing that you understand the complexities of it all.
Exactly. And this whole debate about the relevance of the fundamental duties and whether or not they can be enforced, it becomes even more interesting when you think about the historical context.
You mean the emergency?
Yeah, exactly. The emergency was a pretty crazy time, a lot of political unrest and restrictions on freedom. Some people argue that introducing fundamental duties was like part of a bigger plan by the government.
A plan for what?
Well, to put more emphasis on what citizens owed to the state,
Okay.
maybe even at the expense of individual rights.
Oh, wow.
It really makes you question the motives, right?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Were they really trying to promote civic responsibility, or was it more about the government trying to control things and silence dissenting voices?
Yeah, that's the question, isn't it? It definitely adds another layer of complexity to the whole thing.
Yeah.
So how do we reconcile this historical background with the concept of duties in today's India?
It's a democracy, after all.
Right, exactly. It's a tough one. So are you saying duties are inherently bad or undemocratic? Not necessarily. Every society needs a balance. Rights and responsibilities go hand in hand.
Right, you need both.
It's about finding that sweet spot. And for you UPSC folks, understanding this historical and political context is key. It's going to help you craft those awesome answers that show a deep understanding of the subject.
It's also a good reminder that these aren't just, abstract ideas you read about in textbooks. These things have real-world consequences. The way we interpret and apply them literally shapes the kind of society we build.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, before we move on to the last part of our deep dive, remember what we talked about earlier about the fundamental duties, how they can actually be a source of inspiration.
You mean going beyond the whole legal and political stuff?
Exactly. Because while duty might sound a bit boring and obligatory, some of these duties actually point to values and aspirations that are pretty inspiring.
Okay, I'm listening. Help me see the inspiration here.
Think about it. Promoting harmony among everyone, rejecting practices that are harmful to women, protecting public property, fostering a scientific mindset, striving for excellence in everything we do, individually and collectively.
Yeah.
These aren't just rules, they're goals, ideals to work towards.
I get it. They paint a picture of a better India.
Yeah.
More just, more equitable.
Exactly. And working toward those goals, even if we don't always get it perfect, can be incredibly motivating and fulfilling. It's about realizing that we're all connected, that what we do affects others.
Right.
It's about taking responsibility for shaping the future of our country.
It's a powerful message, and it goes beyond memorizing facts for a test, It's about understanding your role in society and how you can make things better.
Exactly. And before we move on, one last question for everyone listening. If you could add one more fundamental duty to the Indian Constitution, what would it be? And why? Think about it. We'll come back to that in the next segment.
Welcome back. We've been talking about these fundamental duties in the Indian Constitution, really digging into this idea of balancing our rights and responsibilities as citizens.
It's amazing how these duties, added back in 1976, they still matter so much today. It's a really interesting way to look at what it means to be a good citizen, especially in a democracy as diverse as India.
Absolutely. And for our listeners getting ready for those UPSC exams, we've been emphasizing how understanding these duties is super important for those tricky questions. But before we wrap up, let's talk a bit more about how to actually answer those exam questions. What are some things our UPSC folks should really keep in mind when they see questions about fundamental duties?
Good question. First things first, remember the history. Don't forget that these duties weren't in the original Constitution.
Right.
They came in later, in 1976, right after the